Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. The foundational text of yoga isn't some dusty book of ancient mystical secrets. Actually, it's a highly specific, very grounded, and testable manual of mental mechanics. And today, we are going to look at it without any reverence, without any mystical framing, just pure, practical curiosity.
To start us off, I want to give you a number that might completely shock you, 195. I'm going to take a deliberate second here just to let that sink in. There are roughly 195 lines in this entire foundational text. That's the whole thing. And out of all of those lines, only a microscopic fraction even bothers to mention physical posture.
Out of 195 lines, exactly 3 are about physical posture. Just 3. Now, when you consider the massive global industry built around yoga studios, athletic apparel, and intense physical workouts, this is a pretty glaring irony. And here's the real kicker. Those 3 lonely lines, they don't describe a single pose you would actually recognize from a modern yoga class. There is no downward dog, there's no sun salutation, no warrior pose, not one single named posture appears anywhere in the entire text. So if the founding document of yoga is almost entirely not about the physical thing we now call yoga, what exactly is this document actually about? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. Series preview. 2. What the text is. 3. The real definition. 4. Origin of the poses. 5. Testing the claim. And 6. Weighing the evidence.
Section 1. Series preview. What we will uncover.
So, over the next 12 parts of this explainer series, we are going to work through the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali properly. But we are absolutely not going to treat it as a sacred scripture that just needs to be admired or blindly followed. We're going to treat it as a set of claims about how the human mind works, claims that can actually be checked and tested. Because Patanjali isn't asking you to just believe him on faith, he is describing a very clear system of mental mechanics. Which brings us to the biggest question. What is it about, and how in the world did modern physical yoga drift so incredibly far from its founding document? Just take a second to let that question breathe. We have this massive, sweaty, movement-based industry sitting squarely on top of an ancient text that barely even mentions the physical human body. It's fascinating.
To figure out exactly how we got here, we're going to spend some real time unpacking specific mysteries across this series. We're going to look at where the poses actually came from and why the honest historical answer is roughly 100 years old, not 2,000. We'll explore Patanjali's central claim that an unsettled, moving mind is the actual root of unhappiness. We'll examine the hard evidence behind slow breathing, figuring out which specific rhythm genuinely changes your body's nervous system. We'll see how Patanjali's 5 roots of suffering map remarkably well onto modern psychology. We'll dive into the neuroscience of old habits and how Patanjali described them as mental grooves centuries before we had the fMRI machines to actually prove it. And yes, we are absolutely going to tackle the awkward stuff. Look, Chapter 3 makes some rather wild claims, stating that sustained concentration lets you become invisible, recall past lives, or even levitate. I'm not going to pretend that isn't in there, and I am certainly not going to pretend it holds up to scientific rigor. We're actually going to spend a whole episode on it, because critically testing the evidence, especially the parts that fail spectacularly, is the whole point of doing this explainer in the first place.
Which brings us to Section 2, what the text is, a systematization. We need to completely remove any mystical veneer right now to understand what this text actually is. The dates for the author, Patanjali, are genuinely contested. Estimates run anywhere from 200 BCE all the way to the 5th century CE. However, a lot of current historical scholarship leans toward the later end of that, somewhere around 350 to 450 CE. But the absolutely crucial point here is that the text isn't original in the sense of inventing completely new ideas out of nowhere. Patanjali wasn't a lone prophet receiving divine secrets on a mountaintop. He was an organizer. He took concepts of human psychology that were already widely circulating in early Buddhist, Jain, and Samkhya philosophy, and he systematically organized them into something incredibly compact and practical.
He organized this vast psychological landscape into 4 very short chapters, called padas. And when I say short, I mean it is unbelievably compact. As I mentioned earlier, you could sit down and read the entire text aloud in under an hour. But the difficulty of the text doesn't come from its length, it comes from its extreme compression. Each line is squeezed down almost to the level of a minimalist memory aid. These statements were intentionally designed to be memorized first and then slowly unpacked by a teacher over many years. Reading them cold today is a bit like finding someone else's deeply compressed shorthand lecture notes. Technically, all the raw information is there on the page, but almost none of the context is obvious. And this brilliantly explains exactly why the popular, mainstream interpretation eventually drifted so far from the original intent.
Section 3.
The real definition, line 2.
So what was that original intent? Well, the text wastes absolutely no time telling us. The very first line is essentially just throat clearing, saying, okay, now the teaching of yoga begins. But it's line 2 that defines the entire subject and delivers the core thesis. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. Let's neutrally break down those 3 Sanskrit words to see just how clinical this actually is. Chitta means the mind stuff, not just passing thoughts, but the whole underlying field of mental activity. Vritti means fluctuation, movement, or whirling. And Nirodha means restraint or stilling. Just sit with that translation for a second. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. The foundational definition, right at the top of the foundational text, describes a purely psychological operation. There is absolutely zero physical background here. It is entirely 100% about stilling a moving mind.
Section 4. Origin of the poses. 2 different practices.
So if the definition is entirely mental, you're probably wondering, where do the physical poses actually come in? For that, we have to transition to Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, lines 46 to 48 address posture, and line 46 gives us the entirety of the instruction on how to physically hold your body. Sthira Sukham Asanam. The posture should be steady and comfortable. That's it. That is the whole thing. It is listed third in a broader sequence of 8, mostly internal, psychological limbs. The instruction simply refers to finding a comfortable seated chair so you can do the actual mental work without your back hurting. It's not an athletic routine. The posture is literally just the chair. It is not the point of the exercise.
Historically speaking, there is a massive split here. On one side, we have Patanjali's ancient sutras, heavily focused on mental mechanics with nothing more than modest, seated postures required. And on the other side, we have modern postural yoga. The historian Mark Singleton traced the specific lineage back in 2010, showing that the flowing, athletic, sweat-inducing practice we call yoga today was largely assembled in the early 20th century. It was popularized by a teacher named Krishnamacharya, who essentially blended traditional Indian physical culture with European gymnastics. Now, I want to carefully compartmentalize this and state very neutrally, modern postural yoga works. The physical, cardiovascular, and flexibility benefits are highly documented and real, and nobody needs to stop doing it. But we have to be honest that it is fundamentally a completely different 20th century physical practice that just simply happens to share the exact same name as Patanjali's ancient psychological text.
Section 5. Testing the claim, the wandering mind. Which brings us right back to the mind. Let's test Patanjali's core, highly unusual claim that a fluctuating, moving mind is, in and of itself, the direct source of human unhappiness. Note that he's not talking about the dark or anxious content of the thoughts, but the simple movement of attention itself. Is that actually true? Well, in 2010, Harvard researchers Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert set out to test this exact phenomenon. They collected an astonishing 250,000 data points via a custom iPhone app to find out.
They pinged people at entirely random moments throughout the day to ask 3 simple things: what they were doing, if their mind was actually focused on it, and how happy they felt in that exact moment. The results showed that minds wandered constantly, nearly half the time. But the fascinating part is that people reported being distinctly less happy when their attention drifted, compared to when they were fully absorbed in whatever task they were doing, even if that task was totally boring. And here's the most revealing detail of the whole study. Even when the mind wandered away from a neutral task to think about something distinctly pleasant, like an upcoming vacation, their mood still dropped compared to being fully present. The wandering came first, and the unhappiness reliably followed. In other words, where your attention currently resides predicts your mood much better than what your physical body is actually doing. This perfectly and astonishingly echoes Patanjali's second line from over a millennium ago, Swataha Kara Hak Sayama.
Section 6. Weighing the evidence where it is thin.
But before we just smile and accept that ancient wisdom has been entirely validated by modern science, we have to apply a strict, honest, critical lens to this data. We need to give full weight to where the evidence is actually quite thin. First, let's look at that 2010 Harvard study. This was entirely self-reported data. People were pressing buttons about their own subjective mood on early smartphones. And because this was 2010, the sample skewed heavily toward relatively affluent English-speaking smartphone owners. This is hardly a perfect, diverse representation of humanity in general, and affluent individuals often have very different baseline stress profiles than the global average. Furthermore, the timing analysis strongly suggests a cause and effect between mind wandering and a drop in happiness, but in scientific terms, it is not strict, undeniable proof. And what about all those popular brain imaging studies you see in the news? You know, the ones that show quieter default mode networks in advanced meditators.
We have to methodically acknowledge that these fMRI studies are routinely oversold to the public. The sample sizes are often incredibly small, sometimes just a dozen people. The control groups are frequently weak, and crucially, it is almost impossible to rule out expectation bias. Think about it. If you bring a seasoned monk or a dedicated practitioner into a loud, clunky laboratory, put them in an fMRI machine, and tell them to meditate, everyone in the room knows exactly what is expected to happen. The practitioner might unconsciously alter their state simply to perform well for the researchers. So while the evidence we have is undeniably real and it points in a fascinating direction, the science is far from flawless.
So the crucial takeaway here is this very clear summary. One central claim from well over 1,000 years ago survives contact with modern, critical evidence better than it has any right to. While the entirety of the text isn't scientifically validated, especially considering those wild claims of levitation in later chapters that we're going to cover soon, its foundational premise that a wandering mind generates unhappiness holds up surprisingly well against strict scrutiny.
Every single part of this explainer series will end with something highly practical that you can do. For today, it isn't a complex breathing technique or a weird posture. It is simply establishing a baseline measurement. Step 1, set an alarm on your phone for 4 or 5 completely random points in your day tomorrow. Step 2, when that alarm goes off, note exactly what you were physically doing. Step 3, honestly note if your attention was actually on that task or if you were somewhere else. Do not judge yourself and do not try to immediately fix it. Just count the data points. Most people find their mind wanders far more than they ever expected. Everything we cover in the next 11 episodes is aimed at giving you the mechanical tools to shift this baseline.
Next up in the series, we're going to move to a really fascinating topic, memory. Patanjali claims that the mind moves in exactly 5 specific ways, and one of those ways is memory. But he doesn't treat memory as a perfect recording. He treats it as a built-in distortion. Modern psychological research aligns strangely well with this concept, and we'll unpack the mechanics of that in the next part.
Until then, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to test for yourself. Run the baseline measurement tomorrow. Be completely, ruthlessly honest with yourself. What percentage of the time was your attention actually where you were physically standing? Run the numbers and share your baseline with us in the comments below.